We've come a long way since the start of the season where it felt like Manchester United were dropping points left, right and centre, and Manchester United are now 5th in the league. They're looking really dangerous and looking like they might be worth a place in the Champions League spots. So there's been a huge amount of development under Erik Ten Hag. I want to just explore that a little bit. So we've got Manchester United on the board here. They've been pretty much setting up in the same way in all of their games. So they have a back four, they have some kind of iteration of a midfield three, and then they have a front three as well. Now, the problem that Erik Ten Hag had when he first came in was that the team that he inherited were playing a very specific brand of football. They were really, really good at transitional football. So what they like to do is sit deep, pick the ball up. These are obviously different players to the players that they had last season, but bear with me. And what they would do is they would try and get these oppositions just pushing all the way down the field, and they would allow them to build up with the ball, have the ball at the back, build it around. They would force them to try and generate chances themselves. If it didn't happen, they could then counter-attack at speed. They've got players who are really, really good, Marcus Rashford in particular. And what would happen then is if they could turn the ball over in these sorts of situations, they could then play these out balls. On the other side, you play it down here into the channels. The idea then was that you play this long ball. Rashford would be able to beat a back four, pick the ball up and go and score. And that's all well and good. And Manchester United under Ole Gunnar Solskjaer obviously got a lot of famous victories in that way. But the problem is that some teams just refuse to play ball. And what they'll do, rather than building up from the back, they'll do the same thing that Manchester United did. They'll just sit deep in some kind of block form and force Manchester United then to come up against them and say, fine, you possess the ball, you get your players in dangerous areas, you try and score against us, and we will see if you can manage to do that. And if they can't do that with all of their players up the field, then it leads to huge problems. So you get this situation where they're trying to build up, they can't get it because the opposition are just too congested at the back. And so Manchester United then have a problem because you cannot simply play really transitional football when you're expected to be an elite side, because teams will just sit back and they won't accept you playing that game. But the problem is that you can't just shift from one way of playing, this really transitional way, to then being able to be much better in possession and be able to break down teams overnight. And this is the problem that Erik Ten Hag found when he first turned up. So you may remember the game against Brentford right at the beginning of the season where Manchester United were trying to build up, they were trying to do possessional football, work it down the field, generate dangerous areas and benefit from them. But what Brentford were doing is they just pushed up a really aggressive man-to-man press. Manchester United were trying to build up in these situations. It was actually Eriksen in this situation, but the ball comes in and it was Matthias Jensen, turns him over, wins the ball back and scores a goal. Manchester United ended up losing that game 4-0. They were trying to play the sort of possessional football that you need to play if you're going to be a really elite team, but the opposition were just stopping them from doing that. So Manchester United had a problem at the beginning of the season because they realised that you can't just shift from one style into the other. You are going to have some version of transition. And the big question was Erik Ten Hag going to tear up the copybook? Fast forward to the present day, we've just had a really interesting few games from Manchester United, which actually give us a microcosm that show Erik Ten Hag has actually been really good at developing a flexible play style. So in the games where he has to play one way, he'll play one way, and in the games where he has to play another way, he'll play another way. And between those things, Manchester United have been picking up points. So they won against Spurs, they have managed to grind a point against Chelsea, and then just tonight they've managed to get 3 points against West Ham. So let's have a look at some of the ideas that Erik Ten Hag has developed so that Manchester United can be more flexible and they can be more dangerous, and now they're winning more games. So there's two areas in particular that I want to talk about in terms of this flexibility. And the first area, I think, and probably the most important area, is out of possession. I think Manchester United are now much better at pressing off the ball, and it just gives them a real base for them to be able to build on. So let's just take a look a little bit at what happened against Spurs. So Spurs, as we know, are a team who have a really dangerous front two in Harry Kane and Heung-min Son. And the whole of Spurs' play style is designed to generate space for these two to attack because they're the most dangerous players. The way that they do this is when they're building up, so they just go really, really compact like this. So they'll pull their central midfielders in here and their wing backs in here. They're making the pitch really small over here. And in doing so, the idea is they're going to generate space up here because the opposition, you'd think then, are going to just pull right up in these sorts of situations and try and press the ball. And then this generates all of this space over here where you can attack. So the idea is that Spurs are going to do these really complex build-up patterns. Antonio Conte uses these things called automatisms, which are just automatic routes that they're going to use to try and get their players able to build up in these really tight spaces quickly. And the idea is you eventually get the ball into these sorts of areas, and there's two things you can do. You can find Harry Kane. Kane is a really good passer of the ball, so he might be able to find Son with a through ball here, or you might try and move the ball in these wide areas and again get the ball across as well. But the whole idea is generating space in order to get your best players on the ball and able to attack. Now there's two ways that you can deal with this. One way is you can just refuse to be baited in. You can just sit very deep, and we've seen some teams do that against Spurs this season. But actually what Manchester United did was they went into a really high press, and it was a really aggressive man-to-man press. So the idea was that these players here were going to keep an eye on all of the available options, and what we were going to see is if any attempt at build-up was done, there would be triggered a man-to-man press. So you'd see Rashford coming in here, Shaw coming in here, Fernandes coming in here, Anthony would be dropping in here. And the idea then is you force the ball into wide areas and you reduce the ability for the opposition to actually do these build-up plays. You make it really tricky for anyone to get on the ball in any space and time. And so you cut off those build-ups at source. And Manchester United did this really well. And this meant that Spurs had nothing in possession, really. They couldn't get the ball forward to their dangerous strikers, and the moves broke down. Now, that's a really important aspect of why Manchester United were able to win the game, because it actually stopped Spurs from being dangerous, and it allowed Man United to focus on the things that they wanted to do. And what Manchester United want to do is actually build up with the ball and generate these dangerous chances through build up. They want to move to be an elite team. And the way that Spurs played actually really benefited them here, because as we've said, Spurs are all about generating space for their strikers to attack. So when Manchester United are building up, they're not going to commit really aggressively forward. They are going to attempt to slow down Manchester United's build up. But if Manchester United get past that first phase of pressure, what you'll see is that Spurs will drop in. They'll form a fairly compact block, and they'll just allow Manchester United then to move the ball into these more advanced areas and not give them a huge amount of trouble in build-up. So Manchester United were actually able to get the ball into these more advanced areas quite easily. This was something they struggled with in other games. So Spurs' tactical approach actually allowed Manchester United to do the things that they've been trying to do. They were able to use a high press to stop Spurs from causing them problems, but they were also able to use the way that Spurs were playing to actually build up quite nicely. But there was one problem, and that was chance creation. So they were able to get the ball forward quite comfortably, but Spurs were sitting in a very compact block like this, sitting their players really deep. Manchester United could progress the ball to the final third, but they really struggled to do anything other than take long shots, really. They were taking a lot of shots from these sorts of areas. They actually scored a deflection from Fred that was from outside the box, and then I think Fernandes had a shot from around this sort of area as well, so they were relying on shots from distance. So there's an area where Manchester United needed to work on in terms of improving. And we saw some of these flexible ideas at play in the Chelsea game as well. So Chelsea playing a 3-4-3. They, like Spurs, actually didn't play an aggressive high press. They were quite muted in their forward line, so they were happy to let Manchester United build around with the ball. And what they were trying to do is they were trying to stop Manchester United from being able to build up through the middle, and then they were trying to generate overloads in the wide areas. But the problem was that their press really didn't work. So they only had two central midfielders. Manchester United had three, but they tried to use their striker as a marker on Casemiro, who's the pivot player. But the problem is that when the ball went forward in certain situations, Casemiro would be left unmarked because Aubameyang would go forward, and then we had Jorginho on this side, and he was sitting between these two players, and the general idea was that he would push forward onto Casemiro when the ball was with Martinez and Aubameyang had gone to press him. And the problem was that this then left Eriksen free. So what we saw then was Manchester United really plundering this in the first half, because they would find the ball to Eriksen. Eriksen's now in a huge amount of space, and Manchester United have been able to build up. And Graham Potter, the Chelsea manager, realised this really wasn't sustainable. So what he did is he actually changed things up completely. So he changed his formation to a 4-4-2 diamond. So now 4 defenders instead of 3, pivot player in the middle, 2 centre midfielders wide, a number 10, and then 2 strikers here. And what he's done here then is he's made his formation super narrow, because Manchester United were building up through the middle really comfortably, and if you do that, then Manchester United will punish you. And so instead of trying to dominate in wide areas now, Graham Potter was saying, we're going to stop you from building up through the middle, now you can try and build up in these wide areas. And this is how it played out, particularly in the second half. So what Chelsea were doing is they were saying, fine, you can get the ball to Dalot, sure, and you can see how much space they're in here before they're going to get challenged by one of the outside midfielders. So Manchester United were able to do a load of build-up in the wide areas. They were getting the ball through into these sorts of areas as well. So you could see that Manchester United's flexibility was enabling them to cause problems for other teams. Other teams had to respond to that. Manchester United then were given benefits in build-up phases. But it was the same old problem because Manchester United were still getting the ball forward, but then they were stuck in this sort of area when Chelsea sat deep and narrow and compact. They were stopping Manchester United from generating anything other than shots in these sorts of areas. So Erik Ten Hag has used flexibility in order to solve the problems that they had in build-up, but now that's exacerbated other problems instead. That is generating really dangerous chances and getting bogged down shooting from distance rather than actually trying to find more dangerous shooting situations. This brings us to the West Ham game, and West Ham are actually quite different from the other two teams that we just looked at, because those two teams are going to look to build up the ball, possess and move it down the field into dangerous areas. West Ham are slightly different because they are trying to hold the ball, but they're going to be much more direct. So they're going to be looking to try and get the ball forward really quickly, and they're going to cause problems in those ways. And they're also not going to commit themselves forward a huge amount either. So out of possession, they're just sitting in a mid-block, in a 4-4-2, so the 10 pushes up next to the 9, they're going to sit around the pivot player, and then you'll just see this 4-4-2 here. And what we're going to see here then is the back four coming here. And what's really interesting about this game for me was the decision to play Ronaldo here, but also Rashford as a wide player. And again, we're moving back then into that older code that we talked about at the beginning, where Manchester United were going to try and sit a little bit deeper and they were going to try and hit the opposition at speed. So what we saw a lot in this game was passes from the back over the top into these two channels, also passes from this sort of area in the midfield when a player could get the ball in a certain amount of space, be it Casemiro, be it Eriksen, be it Fernandes. So what they were trying to do is hit West Ham really quickly in transition, and this solves that problem that we talked about before, which is that when they're trying to build up slowly, oppositions are getting to sit in compact blocks outside the box and stop Manchester United from generating chances. And actually, what this means then is that Manchester United can develop much more dangerous situations by getting the ball through here and trying to get Rashford, for example, or Ronaldo or Elanga into these sorts of areas in behind the defence and generating chances in that way. But not only were Manchester United generating chances by being more direct, they also generated chances in other ways, and that's the way that the goal itself came. So we've got a few screenshots here on the board just to show what it looks like. What's really interesting about this is it comes from a throw-in. So you can see here that Diogo Dalot is the thrower in this instance, and actually if you watch the full clip, what you can see is this is Casemiro down here further down the line. Now he initially asks for the ball, Diogo Dalot thinks about throwing it to him, but actually in the end throws it far more centrally. So we've got Christian Eriksen and Bruno Fernandes here, two of the most creative players on the field. So rather than giving it to Casemiro deeper, what he's done is he's thrown the ball into the central space, and then he allows Manchester United to generate a dangerous chance in that way, relying on these creative players. So what Eriksen does is he takes the touch here, first time pass through to Fernandes. Fernandes is able to head the ball into this area, and as you can see now, Christian Eriksen has the ball in a huge amount of space just on the corner of the penalty area. He is able to play the cross in, and Marcus Rashford, playing as a wide player, is able to run in at speed, get over Thilo Kehrer, the right back in this instance, and head the ball past Fabianski in the net. So again, we're seeing more areas where Erik Ten Hag is able to develop his team so that they're able to score in new and different ways. They're not being held back by having to score from distance. They are now generating these more dangerous chances. But Erik Ten Hag hasn't solved all of Manchester United's problems. So by playing in this more direct way against West Ham, they were able to win the game. But towards the end of the game, they were actually quite open in terms of the way that they defended. So with Manchester United pushing forward, West Ham are looking to try and hit at speed into these sorts of areas. Now, Manchester United are using these sorts of players. So the two centre-backs and probably one full-back from either side. So if Shaw is pushing forward, then you'll see Dalot sitting in, and then Casemiro. This is their defensive unit. We call this a rest defence unit, because what we're saying is that when Manchester United are attacking with all of their attacking players, these are the defenders. These are the defenders who are left, the rest of the defence, and the situation that they take up then is quite important to the way that Manchester United will defend if they lose the ball and the ball comes in over the top and they have to defend against these counter-attacks. Manchester United still have a lot of work to do in that respect, but obviously with time, what we're seeing with Erik Ten Hag is that he's solving these problems as he goes. So when you move past one phase of problems, you arrive at another set of problems. So this is going to be the next set of problems that Erik Ten Hag has to solve. So if I were to describe the impact that Erik Ten Hag has had on Manchester United's tactics, I would use the word flexibility. What he's done is he's taken an old style of play that they've had and he's utilised that when he's needed to, but he's also helped them to develop a new, more modern style of playing as well. And the ability to flick between these two different systems is allowing Manchester United to get a lot more points than you might have expected them to do earlier on in the season. And the big question is going to be, as the season goes forward, can he continue to add levels of flexibility to this Manchester United team so they can really challenge at the top of the Premier League?
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic brings you the best sports journalism in the world in a personalised experience, connecting you with the stories and teams that you care about the most. There's coverage of 13 sports, plus direct access to world-class journalists through live Q&As, discussions and podcasts. And you can try it now for free for 30 days by clicking the link in the description.